All right, what's up? I'm back. I'm live. So we're on page 148. We're going into East Africa, 1910 to 1931. But before we do that, I just pulled up this episode, the DJ Vlad, Tommy Sotomayor full interview. He talks about some really cool stuff. He talks about his life and how he got into like the men's rights type of stuff, but there's also some comedy gold in there. In the middle of the interview, Tariq Nasheed comes in to the interview and they start having like a diss competition or a snaps competition, however you want to say it. In the middle of the interview, they both start like going at each other with like insults and stuff. It's hilarious stuff. Hilarious. It's truly a classic interview, I think, at least from my view. So we're going to get into the book here. It's got some Edison stuff to play in the background.
So I'm in West Orange, New Jersey today. This is the Edison Laboratory, Thomas Edison's laboratory.
In the dependent empire,
1800s.
especially around...
So he had a laboratory in Menlo Park, which
in
is
the
pretty
dependent
famous.
empire, especially
That one's
in
gone.
tropical Africa,
north
of the Zambezi River, the Rhodes-Milner Group was unable to achieve most of its desires,
this one is still here.
but was able to win
West Orange,
wide publicity for them, especially for
laboratories and
its
experimental
views
buildings.
on native questions.
The Black Mariah
It
is
dominated
here, the first
the
motion
colonial
picture
office
studio,
in London,
basically.
at least
So I'm
for
going
the
to take you
decade
around and show you this place,
1919
show you what
to
it looks like,
1929.
just read you some of the plaques.
There,
There's so much
Milner
information
was
here.
Secretary of State in
It's fascinating.
1919
it's a
to
whole workshop in there, a
1921,
whole laboratory,
and Armory
tons of
in
machines and equipment.
1924
There's
to
a music room,
1929,
photograph stuff, dark
while
room.
the post of parliamentary undersecretary was held by three members of the group for most of the decade.
Steel-toe boots,
Publicity for their views on civilizing the natives and training them for eventual self-government received wide dissemination.
But we've got innovation made in the USA. America's plastic.
Sorry about that. Publicity for their views on civilizing the natives and training them for eventual self-government received wide dissemination, not only by official sources, but also by the academic, scholarly, and journalistic organizations they dominated. As examples of this, we might mention the writings of Copeland, Haley, Curtis, Grigg, Armory, and Lothian, all round-tablers, in 1938. Lord Haley edited a gigantic volume of 1,837 pages called An African Survey. This work was first suggested by Smuts at Rhodes House, Oxford, in 1929, had a foreword by Lothian, and an editorial board of Lothian, Haley, Copeland, Curtis, and others. It remains the greatest single book on modern Africa. These people and others, through the Times, the Round Table, the Observer, Chatham House, and other conduits, became the chief source of ideas on colonial problems in the English-speaking world. Nevertheless, they were unable to achieve their program. In the course of the 1920s, the Round Table program for East Africa was paralyzed by a debate on the priority which should be given to the three aspects of the group's project for a Negro Dominion north of the Zambezi. The three parts were 1. Native rights, 2. Closer union, and 3. International trusteeship. Generally, the group gave priority to closer union, federation of Kenya with Uganda and Tanzania, but the ambiguity of their ideas on native rights made it possible for Dr. Joseph H. Oldman, spokesman for the organized nonconformist missionary groups, to organize a successful opposition movement to Federation of East Africa. Man, these sentences are like cut off in the middle. In this effort, Oldham found a powerful ally in Lord Lugard and considerable support from other informed persons, including Marjorie Perham. The Round Tablers, who had no first-hand knowledge of native life or even of tropical Africa, were devoted supporters of the English way of life and could see no greater benefit conferred on natives than to help them to move in that direction. This, however, would inevitably destroy the tribal organization of life, as well as the native systems of land tenure, which were generally based on tribal holdings of land. The white settlers were eager to see these things disappear, since they generally wished to bring the native labor force in African lands into the commercial market. Oldham and Lugard opposed this, since they felt it would lead to white ownership of large tracts of land on which detribalized and demoralized natives would subsist as wage slaves. Moreover, to Lugard, economy and colonial administration required that natives be governed under his system of indirect rule through tribal chiefs. Closer union became a controversial target in this dispute because it involved a gradual increase in local self-government, which would lead to a greater degree of white settler rule. The opposition to closer union in East Africa was successful in holding up this project in spite of the Round Table's domination of the colonial office, chiefly because of Prime Minister Baldwin's refusal to move quickly. This delay changed until the Labour government took over in 1929. In this, the pro-native, non-conformist, especially Quaker, influence was stronger. The trusteeship issue came into this controversy because Britain was bound, as a mandate power, to maintain native rights in Tanzania to the satisfaction of the Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. This placed a major obstacle in the path of Round Table efforts to join Tanzania with Kenya and Uganda into a Negro Dominion, which would be under quite a different kind of trusteeship of the African colonial powers. Further south, in the Rhodesia and Nyasaland, the Round Table obsession with federation did not meet this obstacle, and that area was eventually federated over native protest in 1953. But this creation, the Central African Federation, broke up again in 1964. Strangely enough, the League of Nations mandate system, which became such an obstacle to the Round Table plans, was largely a creation of the Round Table itself. So it's basically just them arguing about different ways that they can do it, but they're never really asking the natives or locals or whatever what they actually want. The Milner Group used the defeat of Germany in 1918 as an opportunity to impose an international obligation on certain powers to treat the natives fairly in the regions taken from Germany. This opportunity was of great significance because just at that time, the earlier impetus in this direction arising from missionaries was beginning to weaken as a consequence of the general weakening of religious feeling in European culture. The chief problem in East Africa arises from the position of the white settlers of Kenya. Although this colony rests directly on the equator, its interior highlands, 40,000 to 10,000 feet up, were well adapted for white settlement and to European agricultural methods. The situation was dangerous by 1920 and grew steadily worse as the years passed until 1950. Kenya had the most critical native problem in Africa. It differed from South Africa. What is that? It differed from South Africa in that it lacked self-government, rich mines, or a divided white population, but it had many common problems, such as overcrowded native reserves, soil erosion, and discontented and detribalized blacks working for low wages on lands owned by whites. It had about 2 million blacks and only 3,000 whites in 1910. 40 years later, it had about 4 million blacks, 100,000 Indians, 24,000 Arabs, and only 30,000 whites, of which 40% were government employees. But what the whites lacked in numbers, they made up in determination. The healthful highlands were reserved for white ownership as early as 1908, although they were not delimited and guaranteed until 1939. They were organized as a very large, mostly underdeveloped farms, of which there were only 2,000 covering 10,000 square miles in 1940. Many of these farms were of more than 30,000 acres and had been obtained from the government either by purchase or on very long 1,000-year leases for only nominal cost, rents about 2 cents per year per acre. The native reserves amounted to about 50,000 square miles of generally poorer land, or 5 times as much land for the blacks, although they had at least 150 times as many people. The Indians, chiefly in commerce and crafts, were so industrious that they gradually came to own most of the commercial areas, both in the towns and in the native reserves. The two great subjects of controversy in Kenya were concerned with the supply of labor and the problem of self-government, although less agitated problems like agricultural technology, sanitation, and education were of vital significance. The whites tried to increase the pressure on natives to work on white farms rather than to seek to make a living on their own lands within the reserves, by forcing them to pay taxes in cash, by curtailing the size or quality of the reserves, by restricting improvements in native agricultural techniques, and by personal and political pressure and compulsion. The efforts to use political compulsion reached its peak in 1919 and was stopped by Milner, although his group, like Rhodes in South Africa, was eager to make natives more industrious and more ambitious by any kinds of social, educational, or economic pressures. The settlers encouraged natives to live off the reserves in various ways. For example, by permitting them to settle as squatters on white estates in return for at least 180 days of work a year at the usual low wage rates. To help both black and white farmers not only in Kenya but throughout the world, Milner created, as a research organization, an Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad in 1919. As a consequence of various pressures which we have mentioned, notably the need to pay taxes which averaged perhaps 1 month's wages a year and, in the aggregate, took from the natives a larger sum than realized from the sale of native products, the percentage of adult males working off the reservation increased from about 35% in 1925 to over 80% in 1940. This had very deleterious effects on tribal life, family life, native morality, and family discipline, although it seems to have had beneficial effects on native health and general education. The real crux of controversy before the Mau Mau uprising of 1948 to 1955 was the problem of self-government. Pointing to South Africa, the settlers in Kenya demanded self-rule which would allow them to enforce restrictions on non-whites. A local colonial government was organized under the Colonial Office in 1906. As was usual in such cases, it consisted of an appointive governor assisted by an appointed executive council and advised by a legislative council. The latter had also, as usual, a majority of officials and minorities of unofficial outsiders. Only in 1922 did the unofficial portion become elective, and only in 1949 did it become a majority of the whole body. The efforts to establish an elective element in the Legislative Council in 1919 to 1923 resulted in violent controversy. The draft drawn by the Council itself provided for only European members elected by a European electorate. Milner added 2 Indian members elected by a separate Indian electorate. In the resulting controversy, the settlers sought to obtain their original plan, while London sought a single electoral roll restricted in size by educational and property qualifications, but without mention of race. To resist this, the settlers organized a vigilance committee and planned to seize the colony, abduct the governor, and form a republic federated in some way with South Africa. From this controversy came eventually a compromise, the famous Kenya White Paper of 1923, and the appointment of Sir Edward Grigg as governor for the period of 1925 to 1931. The compromise gave Kenya a legislative council containing representatives of the imperial government, the white settlers, the Indians, the Arabs, and a white missionary to represent the blacks. Damn. Except for the settlers and Indians, most of these were nominated rather than elected, but by 1949, as the membership was enlarged, election was extended, and only the official and Negro members, 4 out of the 41, were nominated. The Kenya White Paper of 1923 arose from a specific problem in a single colony, but remained the formal statement of imperial policy in tropical Africa. It said, primarily Kenya is an African territory, and His Majesty's government think it necessary definitely to record their considered opinion that the interest of the African natives must be paramount, and that if and when those interests and the interest of the immigrant races should conflict, the former should prevail. The administration of Kenya, His Majesty's government, regards themselves as exercising a trust on behalf of the African population, and they are unable to delegate or share this trust, the object of which may be defined as the protection and advancement of the native races. As a result of these troubles in Kenya and the continued encroachment of white settlers on native reserves, Armory sent one of the most important members of Milner's group to the colony as governor and commander-in-chief. This was Sir Edward Grigg, who had been a member of Milner's kindergarten, an editor of the Round Table and the Times from 1903 to 1905, 1908 to 1913, a secretary to Lord George and to the Rhodes Trustees, 1923 to 1925, and a prolific writer on British, imperial, colonial, and foreign affairs. In Kenya, he tried to protect native reserves while still forcing natives to develop habits of industry by steady work, to shift white attention from political to technical problems such as agriculture, and to work towards a consolidation of tropical Africa into a single territorial unit. He forced through the colonial legislature in 1913 the Native Land Trust Ordinance, which guaranteed native reserves, but these reserves remained inadequate and were and were increasingly damaged by bad agricultural practices. Only in 1925 did any sustained effort to improve such practices by natives begin. About the same time, efforts were made to extend the use of native courts, native advisory councils, and to train natives for administrative service. All of these met slow, varied, and on the whole, indifferent successes, chiefly because of the natives' reluctance to cooperate and the natives' growing suspicion of white men's motives, even when these whites were most eager to help. The chief cause of this growing suspicion, which in some cases reached a psychotic level, would seem to be the natives' insatiable hunger for religion and his conviction that the whites were hypocrites who taught a religion that they did not obey, were traitors to Christ's teachings, and were using these to control the natives and to betray their interests under the cover of religious ideas, which the whites themselves did not observe and practice. All right, so now we're on page 153, India to 1926. In the decade 1910 to 1920, the two greatest problems to be faced in creating a commonwealth of nations were India and Ireland. There can be no doubt that India provided a puzzle infinitely more complex, as it was more remote and less clearly envisioned than Ireland. When the British East India Company became the dominant power in India about the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was in the last stages of disintegration. Provincial rulers had only nominal titles sufficient to bring them immense treasure in taxes and rents, but they generally lacked either the will or the strength to maintain order. The more vigorous tried to expand their domains at the expense of the more feeble, oppressing the peace-loving peasantry in the process. While all legal power was challenged by roaming upstart bands and plundering tribes, of these willful tribes, the most important were the Marathas. These systematically devastated much of south-central India in the last half of the 18th century, forcing each village to buy temporary immunity from destruction, but steadily reducing the capacity of the countryside to meet their demands because of the trail of death and economic disorganization they left in their wake. By the 1800s, only 1/5 of the land in some areas was cultivated. Although the East India Company was a commercial firm, primarily interested in profits and thus reluctant to assume a political role in this chaotic countryside, it had to intervene again and again to restore order, replacing one nominal ruler by another, and even taking over the government of those areas where it was more immediately concerned. In addition, the cupidity of many of its employees led them to intervene as political powers in order to divert to their own pockets some of the fabulous wealth which they saw flowing by. For these two reasons, the areas under company rule, although not contiguous, expanded steadily until by 1858 they covered 3/5 of the country. Outside the British areas were over 500 princely domains, some no larger than a single village, but others as extensive as some states of Europe. At this point, in 1857 to 1858, a sudden violent insurrection of native forces, known as the Great Mutiny, resulted in the end of the Mughal Empire and of the East India Company, the British government taking over their political activities. From this flowed a number of important consequences. Annexation of native principalities ceased, leaving 562 outside British India, but under British protection and subject to British intervention to ensure good government. Within British India itself, good government became increasingly dominant and commercial profit decreasingly so for the whole period of 1858 to 1947. British political pressure, oh, British political prestige rose to new heights from 1858 to 1890 and then began to dwindle, falling precipitously in 1919 to 1922. The task of good government in India was not an easy one. In this great subcontinent with a population amounting to almost 1/5 of the human race, were to be found an almost unbelievable diversity of cultures, religions, languages, and attitudes. Even in 1915, modern locomotives linked together great cities with advanced industrial production by passing through jungles inhabited by tigers, elephants, and primitive pagan tribes. The population, which increased from 284 million in 1901 to 389 million in 1941 and reached 530 million in 1961, spoke more than a dozen major languages divided into hundreds of dialects, and were members of dozens of antithetical religious beliefs. There were, in 1941, 255 million Hindus, 92 million Muslims, 6.3 million Christians, 57 million Sikhs, 1.5 million Jains, and almost 26 million pagans amidst the various kinds. In addition, the Hindus and even some of the non-Hindus were divided into 4 major hereditary castes, subdivided into thousands of subcastes, plus a lowest group of outcasts, untouchables, amounting to at least 30 million persons in 1900 and twice this number in 1950. These thousands of groups were endogamous, practiced hereditary economic activities, frequently had distinctive marks or garbs, and were usually forbidden to marry, eat, or drink with, or even associate with persons of a different caste. Untouchables were generally forbidden to come in contact, even indirectly, with members of other groups, and were accordingly forbidden to enter many temples or public buildings, to draw water from public wells, even to allow their shadows to fall on any person of a different group. Wow. And were subject to other restrictions, all designed to avoid a personal pollution which could be removed only by religious rituals of varying degrees of elaborateness. Most subcastes were occupational groups covering all kinds of activities, so that there were hereditary groups of carrion collectors, thieves, highway robbers or murderers, thugs. That's where the word comes from India, because it was a caste of people called the Thuggies, as well as farmers, fishermen, storekeepers, drug mixers, or copper smelters. I think pajamas is also an Indian word. For most people of India, caste was the most important fact of life. Submerging their individuality into a group from which they could never escape, and regulating all their activities from birth to death. As a result, India, even as late as 1900, was a society in which status was dominant, each individual having a place in a group, which, in turn, had a place in society. This place, known to all and accepted by all, operated by established procedures in its relationships with the other groups, so that there was, in spite of diversity, a minimum of intergroup friction and a certain peaceful tolerance so long as intergroup etiquette was known and accepted. The diversity of social groups and beliefs was naturally reflected in an extraordinarily wide range of social behavior, from the most degraded and bestial activities based on crude superstitions to even more astounding levels of exalted spiritual self-sacrifice and cooperation. Although the British refrained from interfering with religious practices, in the course of the 19th century, they abolished or greatly reduced the practice of Thugism, in which a secret caste strangled strangers in honor of the goddess Kali; Suti, in which the widow of a deceased Hindu was expected to destroy herself on his funeral pyre. Yeah, that's freaking horrible. Infanticide, temple prostitution, and child marriages. All sounds pretty bad. At the other extreme, most Hindus abstained from all violence. Many had such a respect for life that they would eat no meat, not even eggs, while a few carried this belief so far that they would not molest a cobra about to strike, a mosquito about to sting, or even walk about at night, lest they unknowingly step on an ant or worm. I think that's the Jains. Hindus who considered cows so sacred that the worst crime would be to cause the death of one, even by accident, who allowed millions of these beasts to have free run of the country to the great detriment of cleanliness or standards of living. The reason why they have these like animals walking around is because of they believe in reincarnation. So like there's like temples in India where they have like rats or mice everywhere, because they believe that the spirits of like children that died like very young go into the mice, so they don't kill the mice. And so that's why they let the cows, because they felt like it was like the spirits of their ancestors or something was inside the cow. So yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy, but you know, that was their religious belief at the time. Like, I mean, if you truly believe that the spirits of your ancestors were inside the cow, you probably wouldn't kill it either, you know. So not saying it's right, but it's just that was their belief, so it makes sense. Who would not wear shoes of leather, and would rather die than taste beef, ate pork, and associated daily with Muslims who ate beef but considered pigs to be polluting. In general, most Indians lived in abject poverty and want. Only about 1 in 100 could read in 1858, while considerably less could understand the English language. The overwhelming majority at the time were peasants, pressed down by onerous taxes and rents, isolated in small villages unconnected by roads, and decimated at irregular intervals by famine or disease. British rule in the period 1858 to 1947 tied India together by railroads, roads, and telegraph lines. It brought the country into contact with the Western world, and especially with world markets, by establishing a uniform system of money, steamboat connections with Europe by the Suez Canal, cable connections throughout the world, and the use of English as the language of government and administration. Best of all, British established the new law, equality before the law, and a tradition of judicial fairness to replace the older practice of inequality and arbitrary violence. A certain degree of efficiency and a certain ambitious, if discontented, energy directed towards change replace the older abject resignation to inevitable fate. The modern postal, telegraphic, and railroad system all began in 1854. The first grew to such dimensions that by the outbreak of the war in 1939, it handed over 1 billion pieces of mail and 40 million rupees in money orders each year. The railroad grew from 200 miles in 1855 to 9,000 in 1880 and 25,000 in 1901, and to 43,000 in 1939. This, the third largest railroad system in the world, carried 600 million passengers and 90 million tons of freight a year. About the same time, the dirt tracks of 1858 had been partly replaced by over 300,000 miles of highways, of which only about a quarter could be rated as first class. From 1925 onward, these highways were used increasingly by passenger buses, crowded and ramshackle in many cases, but steadily breaking down the isolation of the villages. Improved communication and public order served to merge the isolated village markets, smoothing out the earlier alternations of scarcity and glut with their accompanying phenomena of waste and of starvation in the midst of plenty. All this led to a great extension of cultivation into more remote areas and the growing of a greater variety of crops. Sparsely settled areas of forest and hills, especially in Assam and in the northwest provinces, were occupied without the devastation of deforestation, as in China or in non-Indian Nepal, because of a highly developed forestry conservation service. Migration, permanent and seasonal, became regular features in Indian life, the earnings of the migrants being sent back to their families in the villages they had left. A magnificent system of canals, chiefly for irrigation, was constructed, populating desolate wastes, especially in the northwestern parts of the country, and encouraging whole tribes which had previously been pastoral freebooters to settle down as cultivators. By 1939, almost 60 million acres of land were irrigated. For this and other reasons, the sown area of India increased from 195 to 228 million acres in about 40 years, 1900 to 1939. Increases in yields were much less satisfactory because of reluctance to change, lack of knowledge or capital, and organizational problems. The tax on land traditionally had been the major part of public revenue in India and remained nearly 50% as late as 1900. Under the Mughals, these land revenues had been collected by tax farmers. In many areas, notably Bengal, the British tended to regard these land revenues as rents rather than taxes, and thus regarded the revenue collectors as owners of the land. Once this was established, these new landlords used their powers to raise rents, to evict cultivators who had been on the same land for years or even generations, and to create an unstable rural proletariat of tenants and laborers able or unwilling to improve their methods. Numerous legislative enactments sought, without great success, to improve these conditions. Such efforts were counterbalanced by the growth of population, the great rise in the value of land, the inability of industry or commerce to drain surplus populations from the land as fast as it increased, the tendency of governments to favor industry or commerce over agriculture by tariffs, taxation, and public expenditures, the growing frequency of famines from droughts, of malaria from irrigation projects, and of plague from trade with the Far East, which wiped out in 1 year's gains made in several years. Gains made in several years. The growing burden of peasant debt at onerous terms and high interest rates, and the growing inability to supplement incomes from cultivation by incomes from household crafts because of growing competition from cheap industrial goods. Although slavery was abolished in 1843, many of the poor were reduced to peonage by contracting debts at unfair terms and binding themselves and their heirs to work for their creditors until the debt was paid. Such a debt could never be paid, in many cases because the rate at which it was reduced was left to the creditor and could rarely be questioned by the illiterate debtor. Okay. All of these misfortunes culminated in the period 1895 to 1901. There had been a long period of declining prices in 1873 to 1896, which increased the burden on debtors and stagnated economic activities. In 1897, the monsoon rains failed, with a loss of 18 million tons of food crops and of 1 million lives from famine. This disaster was repeated in 1899 to 1900. Bubonic plague was introduced to Bombay from China in 1895 and killed about 2 million persons in the next 6 years. From this low point in 1901, economic conditions improved fairly steadily, except for a brief period in 1919 to 1922, the long burden of the World Depression in 1929 to 1934, the rise in prices in 1900 to 1914 benefited India more than others as the prices of her exports rose more rapidly. The War of 1914 to 1918 gave India a great economic opportunity, especially by increasing the demand for her textiles. Tariffs were raised steadily after 1916, providing protection for industry, especially in metals, textiles, cement, and paper. The customs became the largest single source of revenue, alleviating to some extent the pressure of taxation on cultivators. However, the agrarian problem remained acute, for most factors listed above remained in force. In 1931, it was estimated that in the United Provinces, 30% of the cultivators could not make a living from their holdings, even in good years, while 53% could make a living in good years but not in bad ones. There was great economic advance in mining, industry, commerce, and finance in the period after 1900. Coal output went up from 6 to 21 million tons in 1900 to 1924, and petroleum output, chiefly from Burma, went up from 73 to 294 million gallons. Production in the protected industries also improved in the same period until, by 1932, India could produce 3/4 of her cotton cloth, 3/4 of her steel, and most of her cement, matches, and sugar. In one product, jute, India became the chief source for the world's supply. It's JUTE, I'm not sure what that is. And this became the leading export after 1925. A notable feature of the growth of manufacturing in India after 1900 lies in the fact that Hindu capital largely replaced British capital, chiefly for political reasons. In spite of India's poverty, there was a considerable volume of saving, arising chiefly from the inequitable distribution of income to the landlord class and to the moneylenders, if the two groups can be separated in this way. Naturally, these groups preferred to invest their incomes back in the activities whence they had been derived, but after 1919, nationalist agitation and especially Gandhi's influence inclined many Hindus to make contributions to their country's strength by investing in industry. The growth of industry should not be exaggerated, and its influences were considerably less than one might believe at first glance. There was little growth of an urban proletariat or of a class permanent or of a permanent class of factory workers, although this did exist. Increases in output came largely from power production rather than from increases in the labor force. This labor force continued to be rural in its psychological and social orientation, being generally temporary migrants from the villages living under urban industrial conditions only for a few years, with every intention of returning to the village eventually, and generally sending savings back to their families and visiting them for weeks or even months each year, generally at harvest season. This class of industrial laborers did not adopt either an urban or proletarian point of view, were almost wholly illiterate, formed labor organizations only reluctantly because of refusal to pay dues, and rarely acquired industrial skills. After 1915, labor unions did appear, but membership remained small, and they were organized and controlled by non-laboring persons, frequently middle-class intellectuals. Moreover, industry remained a widely scattered activity, found in a few cities but absent from the rest. Although India had 35 cities of over 100,000 population in 1921, most of these remained commercial and administrative centers and not manufacturing centers. That the chief emphasis remained on rural activities can be seen from the fact that these 35 centers of population had a total of 8.2 million inhabitants compared to the 310.7 million outside their limits in 1921. In fact, only 30 million persons lived in the 1,623 centers of over 5,000 persons each, while 289 million lived in centers smaller than 5,000 persons. One of the chief ways in which the impact of Western culture reached India was by education. The charge has frequently been made that the British neglected education in India, or that they made an error in emphasizing education in English for the upper classes rather than education in the vernacular languages for the masses of people. History does not sustain the justice of these charges. In England itself, the government assumed little responsibility for education until 1902, and in general had a more advanced policy in this field in India than in England until well into the present century. Until 1835, the English did try to encourage native traditions of education, but their vernacular schools failed from lack of patronage. The Indians themselves objected to being excluded, as they regarded it, from English education. Accordingly, from 1835, the British offered English language education on the higher levels and the hope that Western science, technology, and political attitudes could be introduced without disrupting religious or social life, and that these innovations would infiltrate downward into the population. Because of the expense, government-sponsored education had to be restricted to the higher levels, although encouragement for vernacular schools on the lower levels began without much financial obligation. In 1854, the infiltration downward theory was quite mistaken because those who acquired knowledge of English used it as a passport to advancement in government, service, or professional life, and became renegades from, rather than missionaries to, the lower classes of Indian society. In a sense, the use of English on the university level of education did not lead to its spread in Indian society, but removed those who acquired it from the society, leaving them in a kind of barren ground which was neither Indian nor Western, but hovered uncomfortably between the two. The fact that knowledge of English and possession of a university degree could free one from physical drudgery of Indian life by opening the door to public service or the professions created a veritable passion to obtain these keys. but only in a minority. The British had little choice but to use English as the language of government and higher education. In India, the languages used in these two fields had been foreign ones for centuries. The language of government and the courts was Persian until 1837. Advanced and middle-level education had always been foreign, in Sanskrit for Hindus and in Arabic for Muslims. Sanskrit, a dead language, was that of Hindu religious literature, while Arabic was the language of the Quran, the only writings the ordinary Muslims would wish to read. In fact, the allegiance of Muslims to the Quran and to Arabic was so intense that they refused to participate in the new English language educational system and, in consequence, had been excluded from government. The professions, and much of the economic life of the country by 1900. No vernacular language could have been used to teach the really valuable contributions of the West, such as science, technology, economics, agricultural science, or political science, because the necessary vocabulary was lacking in the vernaculars. See, that's kind of like in 1984, where they were making the Newspeak language, specifically dumbing down the language. And I'm not saying that they were doing that, but this is the outcome. When you don't have a good vocabulary and you can't understand a lot of word concepts, then it makes it harder for you to communicate, and it makes it harder for you to understand what's going on, right? And I think in the West, in this like new, not the original like style, but this new style is kind of getting into that Brave New World stuff where it's like dumbing down the language, the text, the text speak type of language where everything's an abbreviation or an acronym, and people don't even know the real meanings or the base meanings of the words. And so, like, in 1984, they did that on purpose so that people couldn't like conceptualize certain things. Like they couldn't conceptualize that they were being under control by the government because there was no word for that. They couldn't conceptualize, disagreeing because there was no word for disagreeing, right? So like learning your language is kind of important. I'm not saying that you have to be like a super genius in the language, but looking into a dictionary, if you don't know what a word means, just especially nowadays, you can just type it into the internet and just find out. That's how I did most of my like philosophy study. I'd hear somebody say a word like what ontology, I don't know what that means, so I would just look it up and read the Wikipedia article on it, and then when people talk about it more, then you understand what they're saying. Hyderabad tried to translate Western works into Urdu for teaching purposes after 1920. It was necessary to create about 40,000 new words. Moreover, the large number of vernacular languages would have made the choice of any one of them for the purpose of higher education invidious. And finally, the natives themselves had no desire to read their vernacular languages, at least during the 19th century. They wanted to learn English because it provided access to knowledge, to government positions, and to social advancement as no vernacular could. But it must be remembered that it was the exceptional Indian, not the average one, who wanted to learn to read at all. The average native was content to remain illiterate, at least until deep into the 20th century. Only then did the desire to read spread under the stimulus of growing nationalism, political awareness, and growing concern with political and religious tensions. These fostered the desire to read in order to read newspapers, but this had adverse effects. Each political or religious group had its own press and presented its own biased version of world events, so that by 1940, these different groups had entirely different ideas of reality. Moreover, the new enthusiasm for the vernacular languages and the influence of extreme Hindu nationalists like B.G. Tilak, 1859 to 1920, or anti-Westerners like M.K. Gandhi, 1869 to 1948, led to a wholesale rejection of all that was the best in British or European culture. At the same time, those who sought power, advancement, or knowledge continued to learn English as the key to these ambitions. Unfortunately, these semi-westernized Indians neglected much of the practical side of European way of life and tended to be intellectualist and doctrinary and to despise practical learning and physical labor. They lived, as we have said, in a middle world which was neither Indian nor Western, spoiled for the Indian way of life, but often unable to find a position in Indian society which would allow them to live their own version of a Western way of life. At the university, they studied literature, law, and political science, all subjects which emphasized verbal accomplishments. Since India did not provide sufficient jobs for such accomplishments, there was a great deal of academic unemployment, with resulting discontent and growing radicalism. The career of Gandhi was a result of the efforts of one man to avoid this problem by fusing certain elements of Western teaching with the purified Hinduism to create a nationalist Indian way of life on a basically moral foundation. It is obvious that one of the chief effects of British educational policy has been to increase social tensions within India and to give them a political orientation. This change is usually called the rise of Indian nationalism, but it is considerably more complex than this simple name might imply. It began to rise about 1890, possibly under the influence of the misfortunes at the end of the century, grew steadily until it reached the crisis stage after 1917 and finally emerged in the long-drawn crisis of 1830 to 1947. India's outlook was fundamentally religious, just as the British outlook was fundamentally political. The average Indian derived from his religious outlook a profound conviction that the material world and physical comfort were irrelevant and unimportant, in contrast with such spiritual matters as the proper preparation for the life to come after the body's death. From his English education, the average Indian student derived the conviction that liberty and self-government were the highest goods of life and must be sought by such resistance to authority as had been shown in the Magna Carta, the opposition to Charles I, the Glorious Revolution of 1689, the writings of John Locke and of John Stuart Mill, and the general resistance to public authority found in 19th century liberalism and laissez-faire. These two points of view tended to merge in the minds of Indian intellectuals into a point of view in which it seemed that the English political ideas should be sought by Indian methods, religious fervor, self-sacrifice, and contempt for material welfare or physical comforts. As a result, political and social tensions were exacerbated between British and Indians, between Westernizers and nationalists, between Hindus and Muslims, between Brahmins and lower caste, and between caste members and outcasts. In the early part of the 19th century, there had been a revival of interest in Indian languages and literatures. This revival soon revealed that many Hindu ideas and practices had no real support in the earliest evidence. Since these latter innovations included some of the most objectionable features of Hindu life, such as sati, child marriage, female inferiority, image worship, and extreme polytheism, a movement began that sought to free Hinduism from these extraneous elements and to restore it to its earlier purity by emphasizing ethics, monotheism, and an abstract idea of deity. This tendency was reinforced by the influence of Christianity and of Islam, so that the received Hinduism was really a synthesis of these three religions. As a consequence of these influences, the old and basic Hindu ideas of karma was played down. This idea maintained that each individual soul reappearing again and again throughout eternity in a different physical form and in different social status, each difference being a reward or punishment for the soul's conduct at its previous appearance. There was no real hope for escape from this cycle except by a gradual improvement through a long series of successive appearances to the ultimate goal of complete obliteration of personality, nirvana, by ultimate mergence in the soul of the universe, Brahma. This release, moksha, from the endless cycle of existence could be achieved only by the suppression of all desire, of all individuality, and of all will to live. It's basically like Indian Gnosticism. Society, explaining not only the emphasis on fate and resignation to fate, the idea that man was part of nature and brother to the beast, and submergence of individuality and the lack of personal ambition, but also specific social institutions such as caste or even sati. How could caste be ended if these are God-given traditions for the rewards or punishments earned in an earlier existence? How could sati be ended if a wife is a wife through all eternity and must pass from one life to another when her husband does? The influence of Christianity and of Islam, of Western ideas, of British education in changing Hindu society was largely a consequence of their ability to reduce the average Hindu's faith in karma. One of the earliest figures in this growing synthesis of Hinduism, Christianity, and Islam was Ram Mohan Roy, 1772 to 1833. Founder of the Brahma Samaj Society in 1828. Another was Keshab Chandra Sen, 1841 to 1884, who hoped to unite Asia and Europe into a common culture on the basis of a synthesis of the common elements of these three religions. There were many reformers of this type. Their most notable feature was that they were universalist rather than nationalist, and were westernizers in their basic inclinations. About 1870, a change began to appear, perhaps from the influence of Ramakrishna, 1834 to 1886, and his disciple Swami Vivekananda, 1862 to 1902, founder of Vedanta. I can't pronounce that. This new tendency emphasized India's spiritual power as a higher value than the material power of the West. It advocated simplicity, asceticism, self-sacrifice, cooperation, and India's mission to spread these virtues to the world. One of the disciples of this movement was Gopal Krishna Gokhale, 1866 to 1915, founder of the Servants of India Society, 1905. This was a small band of devoted persons who took vows of poverty and obedience to regard all Indians as brothers, irrespective of caste or creed, and to engage in no personal quarrels. The members scattered among the most diverse groups of India to teach, to weld India into a single spiritual unit, and to seek social reform. In time, these movements became increasingly nationalistic and anti-Western, tending to defend Orthodox Hinduism rather than to purify it, and to oppose Westerners rather than to copy them. This tendency culminated in Bal Gangadhar Tilak, 1859 to 1920, a Marathi journalist of Pune who started his career in mathematics and law, but slowly developed a passion love for Hinduism, even in its most degrading details, and insisted that it must be defended against outsiders, even with violence. He was not opposed to reforms which appeared as spontaneous developments of Indian sentiment, but he was violently opposed to any attempt to legislate reform from above or to bring in foreign influences from European or Christian sources. He first became a political figure in 1891 when he vigorously opposed a government bill which would have curtailed child marriage by fixing the age of consent for girls at 12 years old. Wow. You mean they were going lower than that? Come on, man. By 1897, he was using his paper to incite to murder and riots against government officials. A British official who foresaw this movement towards violent nationalism as early as 1878 sought to divert it into more legal and more constructive channels by establishing the Indian National Congress in 1885. The official in question, Allen Octavian Hume, 1829 to 1912, had the secret support of the Viceroy, Lord Dufferin. They hoped to assemble each year an unofficial Congress of Indian leaders to discuss Indian political matters in the hope that this experience would provide training in the working of representative institutions and parliamentary government. For 20 years, the Congress agitated for extension of Indian participation in the administration and for the extension of representation and eventually of parliamentary government within the British system. It is notable that this movement renounced violent methods, did not seek separation from Britain, and aspired to form a government based on the British pattern. Support for the movement grew very softly at first, even among Hindus, and there was open opposition led by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan among the Muslims. As the movement gathered momentum after 1890, many British officials began to oppose it. At the same time, under pressure from Tilak, the Congress itself advanced its demands and began to use economic pressure to obtain these. As a result, after 1900, fewer Muslims joined the Congress. There were 156 Muslims out of 702 delegates in 1800, but only 17 out of 756 in 1905. All these forces came to a head in 1904 to 1907 when the Congress for the first time demanded self-government within the Empire for India and approved the use of economic pressures, boycotts against Britain. The Japanese victory over Russia in 1905, which was regarded as an Asiatic triumph over Europe, the Russian revolt of 1905, the growing power of Tilak over Gokhale in the Indian National Congress, and public agitation over Lord Curzon's efforts to push through an administrative division of the huge province of Bengal, population 78 million, brought matters to a head. There was open agitation by Hindu extremists to spill English blood to satisfy the goddess of destruction, Kali. In the Indian National Congress of 1907, the followers of Tilak stormed the platform and disrupted the meeting. Much impressed with the revolutionary violence in Russia against the Tsar and in Ireland against the English, this group advocated the use of terrorism rather than petitions in India. The Viceroy, Lord Hartington, was wounded by a bomb in 1912. For many years, radical intolerance against Indians by English residents in India had been growing and was increasingly manifested in studied insults and even physical assaults. In 1906, a Muslim League was formed in opposition to Hindu extremists and in support of the British position. But in 1913, it also demanded self-government. Tilak's group boycotted the Indian National Congress for 9 years, 1907 to 1916, and Tilak himself was in prison for sedition for 6 years, 1908 to 1914. The constitutional development of India did not stand still during this tumult. In 1861, appointive councils with advisory powers had been created, both at the center to assist the viceroy and in the provinces. These had non-official as well as official members, and the provincial ones had certain legislative powers, but all these activities were under strict executive control and veto. In 1892, these powers were widened to allow discussion of administrative questions, and various non-governmental groups called communities were allowed to suggest individuals for unofficial seats in the council. A third act of 1909, passed by the Liberal government with John Morley as Secretary of State and Lord Minto as Viceroy, enlarged the councils, making a non-official majority in the provincial councils, allowed the councils to vote on all issues, and gave the rights to elect the non-official members to various communal groups, including Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, on a fixed ratio. This last provision was a disaster. By establishing separate electoral lists for various religious groups, it encouraged religious extremism in all groups, made it likely that the more extremist candidates would be successful, and made religious differences the basic and irreconcilable fact of political life. By giving religious minorities more seats than their actual proportions of the electorate, entitled them to a principle known as weightage, it made it politically advantageous to be a minority. By emphasizing minority rights, in which they did believe, over majority rule, in which they did not believe, the British made religion a permanently disruptive force in political life and encouraged the resulting exacerbated extremism to work out its rivalries outside the constitutional framework and the scope of legal action in riots rather than at the polls or in political assemblies. Moreover, as soon as the British had given the Muslims this special constitutional position in 1909, they lost the support of the Muslim community in 1911 to 1919. This loss of Muslim support was the result of several factors. Curzon's division of Bengal, which the Muslims had supported since it gave them East Bengal as a separate area with a Muslim majority, was countermanded in 1911 without any notice to the Muslims. British foreign policy after 1911 was increasingly anti-Turkish and thus opposed to the Caliph, the religious leader of the Muslims. As a result, the Muslim League called for self-government in India for the first time in 1913, and 4 years later formed an alliance with the Indian National Congress, which continued until 1924. All right. I've been reading for like an hour now. I think I'm going to call it quits for right now. I'm on page 164. I mean, there's only a couple more pages in this section. This one just keeps going on. All right. So that's about that for today. You can check out more information on the Edison factory. There's a lot of different weird Edison stuff in New Jersey. Like obviously the first movie theaters there, and you know, the first telegraph lines and telephone, the light bulb, record player, all that stuff. So, you know, you can always check out that type of information yourself. I'll probably be back later. Got to get organized. So, thanks for checking out the video if you did. Otherwise, talk to you later and peace.